The fluorescent light in Supply Depot 3B was a specific kind of sickening yellow, the kind that promised bureaucracy and guaranteed migraines. It was a weak, persistent hum, a sound that overlaid the base's otherwise constant low-frequency thrum of jet engines spooling up, or the distant rhythmic staccato of automatic fire from the qualification range 2 miles away. Cabo Silva stood perfectly still, hands resting lightly on the aluminum handle of her mop. The mop head itself, thick industrial cotton, was leaning against a stack of UN-issued thermal blankets, its fibers stiff with dried floor wax and the ghosts of 1,000 spills. Coffee, hydraulic fluid, and once, a small pool of something vaguely biological that nobody wanted to discuss. Silva was small, almost unnervingly so for this environment. Her frame was taut, not bulky, and she wore fatigues 3 shades too faded, smelling perpetually of chlorine and the deep, clean scent of industrial-grade detergent, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat that coated everyone else. Her hair was pulled back so tightly that the skin around her temples looked stretched, giving her face an expression of perpetual, weary alertness. She was tired, the kind of deep bone marrow fatigue that accumulated over years of performing thankless tasks in the periphery of serious warfighters. She had been waiting for 23 minutes. The air in the depot smelled like stale paper, cheap particle board furniture, and the faintly metallic odor of oxidation on forgotten tools. Every surface was coated in a fine, almost invisible layer of grey logistics dust. Behind the counter, reigning over this kingdom of unallocated necessities, sat Sergeant First Class Morrison. Morrison was not a warrior. He was an administrator who had mastered the delicate art of weaponizing paperwork. He wore perfectly starched fatigues, the creases sharp enough to cut glass, and his rank insignia gleamed with a practiced, polished brilliance. His hands were soft, his knuckles smooth, unused to friction beyond the grinding of gears inside the supply chain system. Morrison was leaning back in his squeaky executive chair, a chair clearly requisitioned far above his pay grade, reading the day's casualty report, not for sympathy, but for procedural reference. He was slowly, deliberately peeling the wrapper off a protein bar, the crinkle of the plastic grating on Silva's already frayed nerves. Crinkle, pause, crinkle. Silva needed solvent, specifically the high-grade biohazard-certified solvent reserved for sanitation units operating in sensitive areas. The standard floor cleaner wouldn't touch the grease and grit accumulating in the motor pool's main decontamination bay, where she was currently scheduled to spend the next 5 hours. She cleared her throat, a dry, faint sound. Morrison didn't look up. He took a large, unnecessary bite of the protein bar, chewing with his mouth slightly ajar, a small, wet squish accompanying the mastication of fortified chocolate and synthetic fiber. "Supply request form 37 Delta, Sergeant," Silva stated, her voice low, even, and meticulously respectful. The repetition was the key to their power dynamic. She had to be perfect. Morrison finished chewing, swallowed with an audible gulp, and then, slowly, looked up. His eyes, small and cold, didn't meet hers. They rested instead on the mop, then on the designation tape on her chest. Cabo Silva. "Cabo," Morrison drawled, drawing the 2 syllables out like taffy, a subtle inflection suggesting that the rank of corporal was suitable only for polishing floors. He picked up the clipboard she had handed him nearly half an hour prior, flipping the laminated pages with the tip of a perfectly manicured index finger. "Section C, Industrial Solvent, Level 4, he recited, his tone implying she was asking for the keys to Fort Knox. "Do you understand the classification of Level 4 materials, Corporal?" "Yes, Sergeant. It's restricted for heavy-duty biological and chemical contamination. The motor pool's cleaning unit is insufficient for the grease and carbon buildup." "I didn't ask you to recite the material safety data sheet, Corporal," Morrison interrupted, his voice gaining a sudden, manufactured edge of authority. "I asked if you understood. Level 4 materials are logged with the battalion quartermaster. They are expensive, They are not for cleaning up spilled soda or, what is the phrase the sanitation detachment uses, routine maintenance. Morrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, pushing his face closer. His breath smelled faintly of synthetic vanilla and bitterness. I have access to your daily logs, Corporal. You scrub toilets. You empty trash receptacles. You mop floors. You are a janitor. You are not utilizing equipment rated for tactical decontamination of a nuclear, biological, or chemical incident. Therefore, the answer is no. Silva held the gaze, the small muscles around her jaw twitching almost imperceptibly. This was the moment of the needle, the direct assault on her duty and her rank, framed as fiscal responsibility. "Sergeant," she began, her tone hardening just enough to register resistance. "The build-up in Bay 3 is currently impacting operational safety. The tread grip is compromised, and the risk of slip and fall is elevated." "Stop, Corporal," Morrison said, his voice now chillingly soft. He picked up a thick, specialized pen, a tactile pen reserved for officers and administrators, and tapped the form. "Here's the thing, Corporal Silva. I don't care about the operational safety of your mop bucket. I care about allocation integrity. You are wasting my time, tying up inventory that could be used by men who are actually doing the mission." Yes, he slid the form back across the counter, the movement deliberately slow, insulting. "Go back to your little broom closet, clean what you can with the pink disinfectant, and stop pretending that scrubbing floors makes you some kind of essential personnel. You're a mop jockey, Corporal. Get back on the line and stop bothering the people who actually wear the star." The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Silva's face, usually masked by a neutral, almost distant expression, tightened. She didn't pick up the form immediately. Her gaze dropped to Morrison's chest, resting for a fraction of a second on his spotless uniform, devoid of any genuine campaign ribbons, just the basic service ribbons required to exist on the base. The fluorescent light hummed, the air conditioner sputtered. Suddenly, a new presence entered the perimeter of Depot 3B. It wasn't the loud, heavy bootfall of a grunt, nor the relaxed swagger of an officer. This was a presence defined by the displacement of air, a movement so economical and quiet that the man seemed to simply materialize. He was tall, built like tightly wound steel wire, and his uniform was immaculate, but in a different way than Morrison's. It was perfectly functional, broken in, with a faint sheen of oil and dust ground into the synthetic fibers, suggesting long-term field use. He wore no visible rank, only a small, subdued flash of insignia on his shoulder, the specific, unidentifiable sigil of Tier 1 Special Operations. He was carrying a rifle case, its contents clearly heavy and specialized. This was Sergeant First Class Radek. His eyes, the color of gunmetal gray, swept the depot in one smooth, comprehensive motion, processing the stacked supplies, the exit routes, the nervous energy of the logistics sergeant, and finally, the rigid posture of the corporal with the mop. Radek stopped about 10 feet from the counter, setting the rifle case down gently without a sound. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, radiating an intense, silent pressure that instantly made the air heavier. Morrison, caught mid-smirk at his own clever insult, paused. He hated operators. They ignored the proper paperwork and treated his depot like a glorified vending machine. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" Morrison asked, the sergeant sounding stiff. Radek ignored him completely. His gaze remained fixed on Silva. He was examining the way she stood, the way she hadn't flinched, the slight tremor in her left index finger where it gripped the mop handle. He looked past the mop, past the faded fatigues, and focused on the small details that only another professional would notice. He saw the way the corporal's posture was too correct, too stable, the low center of gravity. He saw the precise, almost imperceptible way her head turned as she processed the room, a practiced scan for threats, not dust bunnies. He looked at the subtle discoloration around her left shoulder blade, visible through the thin fabric of her uniform, a faint, ropey scar tissue, and then his gaze fixed on the inner forearm of her right arm, Just visible below the rolled sleeve, there was a tattoo. It wasn't large or flashy. It was a single black line, a stylized representation of a winged dagger entwined with an anchor, but rendered in a deceptively simple folk art style common among specific Eastern European units. Below it, nearly hidden by the crease of her elbow, was a small, almost microscopic cluster of dots, a tactical cipher. Radek's expression remained utterly neutral, but his internal temperature dropped several degrees. He knew that tattoo. He knew exactly what it meant and who earned the right to wear it. He stepped closer to Silver, forcing Morrison to crane his neck slightly to keep them in view. "Corporal," Radek's voice was a low rumble, polished and precise, carrying the faintest hint of a Slavic cadence. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was looking for the quartermaster." Silver finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was no recognition, only deep professionalism. "He's in Annex A, Sergeant, down the main corridor, first door on the right." "Thank you." Radek turned his attention back to Morrison, his posture shifting, suddenly dominating the space. He didn't raise his voice, but the acoustic quality of the depot changed. Every sound seemed to retract in the presence of his focus. "Sergeant," Radek said, indicating the refusal form still sitting on the counter. "What is the nature of this dispute?" Morrison bristled. "This is a logistics issue, Sergeant. It doesn't concern tactical personnel. This corporal is attempting to requisition level 4 biosolvent for routine floor cleaning. It's an unwarranted allocation of high-value assets." Radek simply leaned a fraction of an inch closer, his shadow falling across the pristine counter. "High-value assets. I see." He looked back at Silver. "Corporal, show me your service record." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the unspoken authority of a man who reviewed operational profiles, not inventory lists. Silver hesitated for a microsecond. The order seemed nonsensical in the context of a supply request, but her training took over. She reached into her fatigue pocket and produced her identification and service folder, handing it to Radek without a word. Radek took the file, but he didn't open it. He weighed it in his hand, his eyes scanning Silver's face again. He wasn't interested in paper. He was interested in confirmation. "Corporal," Radek said, his voice dropping even lower, demanding absolute silence. "I need you to confirm your last assignment prior to this posting, the one that resulted in this." He gently tapped the area just below her left scapula, exactly where the scar tissue was thickest. Silver's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise she had shown. She knew that scar was usually concealed by the webbing of a pack or vest. "Ghazni Province, 2018, Sergeant. NATO Advisory Team 5, she confirmed. Morrison snorted under his breath, leaning back again. "We all did a tour in the sandbox, Corporal. That doesn't mean you get the good cleaning chemicals." Radek finally opened the service file, ignoring Morrison completely. His eyes tracked the typed lines, but they stopped almost immediately on a specific entry, highlighted with a small official stamp, a notation of a highly specific foreign award approved for wear on the uniform. Radek closed the file, snapping the cover shut with a sharp, final sound. He didn't look at the ribbon bar on Silver's chest. Logistics soldiers like Morrison often wore unauthorized or cheaply manufactured replicas. Radek looked at the invisible record, the one written in scars and discipline. He placed the file on the counter, perfectly centered. "Sergeant Morrison," Radek began, the shift in his tone dramatic. The formal address was gone, replaced by a cold, precise interrogation. "You just insulted an operational asset, not a mop jockey." Morrison's face began to flush a patchy red. "Listen here, you high-speed, low-drag." "Be silent," Radek cut him off. The two words were not yelled. They were simply spoken, but they carried the weight of ordnance. Morrison's jaw snapped shut involuntarily. Radek slowly extended his arm, pointing a stiff index finger at Silver's chest, tracing the outline of her uniform where the ribbon bar should have been, had she not chosen to wear the minimal issue mandated for support duty. The designation for NATO Advisory Team 5 2018 Ghazni, Radek stated, his voice resonating with deep, personal knowledge. That designation implies direct engagement outside secure forward operating bases, usually accompanying Polish Special Forces or the Grom Contingent 3. He paused, letting the information sink into the stagnant air. Sergeant Morrison, I'm going to read aloud the decorations authorized for Corporal Silva. Listen carefully, because this is the operational history you just dismissed as janitorial work. Radek's finger rested directly over her heart. Item 1, he stated, his voice ringing with reverence. The Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Standard. Item 2, the Army Commendation Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster. Good service. Item 3, the Joint Service Commendation Medal. Outstanding performance in a multinational environment. Morrison started shifting uncomfortably, recognizing the mounting authority of the list, but still clinging to his institutional arrogance. And finally, Sergeant Morrison, the one that makes your arrogance a disciplinary offense. Radek leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet somehow dominating the space. Cabo Silva, while attached to the Grom contingent, was awarded the highest Polish military honor permitted to a foreign service member for valor in combat, just below the Order of Virtuti Militari. Radek paused, drawing a deep breath. She wears the Krzyż Waleczny, the Polish Cross of Valor. Morrison went pale. He knew that name. Every soldier who paid attention knew the historical weight of the Cross of Valor. It was earned by blood, awarded for acts of extraordinary courage under fire, where the soldier knowingly risked death to save others. Radek looked directly at Morrison, his eyes twin points of intense, focused anger. Tell me, Sergeant, do you still believe that a soldier who has been awarded the Krzyż Waleczny is a mop jockey, unworthy of requisitioning proper cleaning supplies to maintain a military installation? Morrison stammered, his soft hands gripping the edge of the counter. I wasn't aware of the full context of her service, Sergeant. The records are often incomplete in our digital system. They are incomplete only to those who choose not to look past the dirt on the boots, Radek corrected. Radek turned back to Silva, the change in his demeanor immediate and striking. The steel melted into profound respect. Cabo Silva, Radek said softly. You earned that medal in Ghazni. Tell the sergeant why. Silva stiffened, clearly reluctant to speak of it. But the command was clear. It was time for the bureaucracy to acknowledge the reality of the fight. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, the memory washing over her like a tidal wave of scorching Afghan heat and red dust. Backstory expansion, Ghazni Province, 2018. Target 2,000+ words. The sun in Ghazni felt less like heat and more like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs. It was 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was 0, meaning the sweat evaporated instantly, leaving behind only the gritty residue of salt and dirt that chafed constantly against the skin beneath the heavy, restrictive plates of the body armor. Silva, then merely Specialist Silva, a medic cross-trained in specialized communication and EOD protocols, attached to a mixed NATO mentorship team, remembered the precise, hollow silence just before the ambush. They had been moving slowly, a 4-vehicle convoy, through a dried wadi, a perfect choke point. The air was thick with the scent of pulverized gypsum and the bitter smell of burnt diesel. Silva was riding in the 3rd vehicle, a lightly armored MRAP retrofit, positioned to be the immediate reaction force for trauma. Their mission was simple on paper: transport a team of Polish Grom advisors and specialized gear to a forward operating post near the disputed border. Their team leader, a stoic Polish captain named Zawadzki, a man who spoke 6 languages and possessed the quiet intensity of polished granite, was in the lead vehicle. At 14:03 hours, the silence shattered. It wasn't a crack or a bang. It was a terrifying, low-frequency thump followed immediately by the world dissolving into a high-pitched, screaming roar. An improvised explosive device, IED, buried deep beneath the sand, hit the lead MRAP. The vehicle, despite its protection, buckled inward like a crushed aluminum can. The explosion was so powerful that the shockwave punched the air out of Silva's chest, leaving her gasping. The secondary effect was immediate. Synchronized small arms fire erupted from 3 elevated positions along the wadi walls. PKM machine guns, chattering with murderous precision, attempting to suppress any response and finish off the survivors of the lead vehicle. Silva's vehicle lurched to a halt, the driver panicking, slamming the brakes. The ringing in Silva's ears was deafening. She couldn't hear the comms. She could only see the dust cloud boiling around the wreck of Zawadzki's MRAP. She looked down at her own rifle, the familiar cold weight of the metal reassuring. "Medic! Go! Go!" the lieutenant in her vehicle screamed, grappling with the suddenly jammed gun turret. Silva didn't wait for the vehicle to secure. She unbuckled, grabbed her trauma bag, and hit the release catch on the door. Stepping out was like plunging into a furnace lined with razor wire. The air was heavy with the smell of scorched earth, propellant, and the sickening tang of ruptured fuel. The machine guns were concentrating fire on the wreckage. To reach the lead vehicle, Silva had to cross approximately 40 meters of open ground, a flat, exposed stretch of the wadi floor, already pockmarked with fresh impact craters. She knew, with chilling certainty, that 40 meters under heavy fire was a death sentence. But she had seen Zawadzki move just before the blast. He had leaned over, attempting to deploy a smokescreen, meaning he was likely alive, but pinned. Silva dropped into a low crouch, moving with the practiced, fluid grace of a person whose training had transcended conscious thought. The heavy weight of the trauma kit, full of blood bags, field sutures, and specialized intubation gear, pulled at her shoulder, but she compensated instantly. Bzzzt! A stream of tracer rounds chewed the sand exactly where her head had been a second before. She began to run. It wasn't a straight line. It was a zigzag, a controlled, unpredictable sprint where every step was a commitment to survival. The weight of her gear, the friction of the Kevlar vest, the blinding dust, all of it faded into the single urgent imperative: reach Zawadzki. She heard the distinctive, heavier thump of a mortar round being launched. She had 5 seconds. She dove the last 15 feet, skidding violently on the rock and gravel, the impact shaking her teeth. She landed hard against the shredded armor plating of the wrecked MRAP, drawing a ragged, desperate breath. The mortar round hit 10 feet away, spraying shrapnel in a wide, lethal arc. Silva pressed herself flat against the heat-soaked metal. A white-hot piece of metal screamed past her ear, leaving a faint, stinging burn on her neck. She ignored it. The machine gun fire intensified, tearing into the MRAP's side, seeking entry points. "Zawadzki, report!" she yelled, her voice strained against the ringing. A weak groan came from the debris. The driver and co-driver were clearly gone. The blast had vaporized the front half of the cab. Zawadzki, however, had been sitting slightly behind the primary blast zone, the heavy comms equipment array shielding him partially. He was bleeding badly, pinned by the steering column and barely conscious. His left arm was angled unnaturally, shattered. "Comms dead," Zawadzki mumbled, his eyes glazed with shock. "They cut the line. Flank needs air." The crucial element of the ambush was isolating the team. If they couldn't coordinate with the QRF, Quick Reaction Force, or air support, the 2 other vehicles in the convoy, now pinned, would be overwhelmed. Silva assessed the scene in 3 seconds. Zawadzki was critical, but stable for a few minutes. The communication system, the vehicle's integral satellite radio, was destroyed. She needed an alternate comms source. Zawadzki carried a personal, specialized satellite phone, a robust, encrypted device, but it was strapped to his webbing under his shattered arm, inaccessible. The PKM fire was relentless. She couldn't pull him free without exposing both of them. "Captain, I need the SAT phone," she whispered urgently, her face inches from his bloody helmet. Zawadzki, slipping in and out of consciousness, simply groaned. Silva knew what she had to do. She reached for her knife, not her medical kit. She wasn't cutting his webbing. She was cutting the armor plates of his vest that were trapping his comms pouch. She worked furiously, the ceramic blade scraping against the thick nylon, while rounds continuously impacted the metal shell around them. Pang, pang, pang. She finally sliced through the last retaining strap. She pulled the pouch free, retrieved the phone, and flipped open the hardened casing. But to transmit the encrypted coordinates for air support, coordinates that would save the flanking convoy element 300 meters away, she needed line of sight to the sky. She couldn't do it hunched inside the wreck. This was the moment of decision, the moment that defined the Krzyż Walecznych. Silva took a deep breath, tasting the dust and the metallic scent of her own adrenaline. She looked at the captain, administered a quick dose of morphine into his thigh, and whispered a promise in halting Polish she had learned from him. Trzymam straż. I keep watch. Then, gripping the satellite phone, she crawled out of the relative safety of the wreck. She didn't try to find cover. There was none. She scrambled onto the top of the flattened MRAP chassis, the highest point in the immediate vicinity, exposing herself completely to the 3 machine gun nests. As soon as her helmet cleared the vehicle's profile, the chatter of the machine guns instantly shifted, dedicating all their firepower to the single audacious target on the roof. The sound was staggering. It felt like standing in a tin shed while someone fired a dozen jackhammers at the walls. Rounds slammed into the hull beneath her, kicking up sparks and plumes of hot metal. She ignored the physical sensation, focusing only on the small green display of the satellite phone. She found the pre-programmed QRF frequency, held the antenna high, and began transmitting the coded grid coordinates. One round, ricocheting off the main turret assembly, grazed her left side. It wasn't a direct hit, but the force was enough to knock her violently, scraping her hip bone against the jagged metal. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, but she kept the phone steady. Transmission complete. She tumbled back into the wreckage, crashing hard. In the brief 3-second window she had been exposed, she had saved the convoy. The QRF confirmation crackled through the handset. Air support inbound, ETA 3 minutes. The machine gun fire, realizing its target was down, dispersed again, but the damage was done. They had lost the element of surprise. 3 minutes later, the distinctive deep whoomp, whoomp of Apache rotors filled the sky. The attackers, knowing they were now vulnerable to precision air attack, broke contact and scattered into the surrounding hills. Silva spent the next hour under intermittent fire, stabilizing Zawadzki and the one other survivor from the third vehicle, until the ground forces could secure the area. It was only when the situation was calm and the medevac chopper landed that she allowed herself to look at her own injuries. A deep gash from the shrapnel on her hip and a nasty large friction burn and contusion on her left shoulder blade, the exact spot Radek had tapped. From being thrown against the armor plating, she hadn't fought for recognition. She had simply performed her duty, knowing that the cost of failing to transmit those coordinates would have been the annihilation of the entire flanking element. Return to Supply Depot 3B, target 1,500 plus words remaining. Cabo Silva finished her recollection, her voice flat, emotionless. It wasn't a boast. It was a factual report delivered under command. I was exposed for precisely 3.2 seconds on the roof of the vehicle to transmit the fire mission coordinates, Silva stated. I used the body of the destroyed MRAP to shield Captain Zawadzki, while simultaneously administering initial trauma care until the QRF secured the perimeter. Silence blanketed Supply Depot 3B. The humming of the fluorescent light seemed loud, accusing. Morrison was breathing shallowly, his face completely drained of color. He looked from Silva's intense, focused eyes to Radek's unblinking gaze. He finally understood the depth of the title he had flung so carelessly. Mop jockey. He hadn't just insulted a corporal. He had insulted a warrior whose bravery was certified by a NATO-allied nation at the highest level, an act that directly resulted in the preservation of life and mission success. The bureaucratic implication of insulting a Cross of Valor recipient, especially in the presence of an elite operator like Radek, was immediate and catastrophic. Radek stepped forward again, placing his hand gently on the service folder. "Sergeant Morrison," Radek said, his voice now dangerously low, carrying the weight of the 2,000 words just narrated. The Krzyż is not given for completing paperwork or efficiently allocating industrial solvent. It is given for facing machine guns alone to ensure communications integrity and save the lives of your comrades. He picked up the requisition form that Morrison had denied. He didn't sign it. He simply tore it once, sharply, down the middle. Corporal Silva has demonstrated superior judgment in assessing operational needs under extreme duress in a theater of war. I find her judgment regarding the need for level 4 solvent to clean a motor pool bay to be entirely accurate and necessary for the continued operational readiness of this installation. Radek looked at Morrison, whose face was glistening with a sudden film of cold sweat. You will allocate the solvent immediately, Sergeant, and you will personally deliver it to her cleaning cart. Morrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, Sergeant, immediately. He stumbled off the executive chair, its wheels squeaking mournfully. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked urgency. He fumbled with the keys to the secured level 4 cage. Radek waited until Morrison had disappeared down the aisle, his footsteps rapid and disorganized, before turning back to Silva. He reached up, touching the stylized, Polish-winged dagger tattoo on his own neck, a subtle echo of the cipher on her forearm. It was a recognition mark, unit to unit. It is good to see a true soldier performing essential maintenance, Radek murmured. We all depend on a clean operating theater. Silva simply nodded, acknowledging the silent respect. It must be done, Sergeant. Radek then did something unprecedented. He walked back to his rifle case, unzipped the heavy-duty Cordura, and slowly pulled out the contents. It was an HK-416, heavily customized, wearing a high-performance suppressor and state-of-the-art optics. It was his primary weapon, his constant companion, the tool of his trade and perhaps the keeper of his soul. It was spotless, meticulously maintained and heavy with unspoken history. He held the rifle horizontally, inspecting its weight. This was not merely an object, it was an extension of his life force. He turned, approaching Silva slowly. He didn't offer the weapon carelessly. He presented it, butt first, the muzzle pointed safely toward the ground, a gesture deeply rooted in the traditions of elite military respect, an offering of ultimate trust and recognition of shared lineage. Cabo Silva, Radek said, his voice barely audible, thick with respect. I offer you this weapon, not to keep, but to hold. I have carried this rifle through 3 continents and 12 named operations. To hand this to another is to acknowledge their mastery of the craft, their dedication, and their absolute reliability. Silva looked at the weapon. The composite finish was warm under the depot light. She extended her hands, calloused and rough from years of manual labor, and accepted the rifle, cradling the weight respectfully. She recognized the specific calibration of the optics, the custom trigger mechanism. It is heavy, Sergeant, she whispered, the closest she had come to genuine emotion. It is the weight of commitment, Cabo. You carry it well, even now, wielding a mop. Radek reached into a small, zippered pocket on his jacket and produced a tiny, beautifully crafted lapel pin, a miniature representation of the Krzyż itself. I recognize a comrade in arms when I see one, Radek said, pinning the medal onto the thin, faded fabric of her fatigue shirt, just above her name tape. Wear the honor you earned. Let the quartermasters and the logisticians remember exactly who maintains the walls they hide behind. He then leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, professional whisper, referring to the hidden cipher on her arm. The instructor tried to sweep your leg, didn't he? You countered and broke his arm, metaphorically speaking. Silva's lips twitched into the faintest, almost invisible smile, a ghost of a warrior's satisfaction. I simply applied the proper leverage, Sergeant. Morrison returned, rolling a small utility cart, laden with 2 heavy 5-gallon drums of the required level 4 solvent. His movements were shaky, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look up until he was directly beside Silva's cart. He stopped dead when he saw the scene. The elite operator SFC Radek standing in solemn deference, and the cabo, the janitor, holding a $500,000 customized assault rifle, wearing the unmistakable symbol of foreign valor on her chest. Morrison stammered out an apology that was weak and barely coherent. "Xi Cabo Silva, my profound apologies. The solvent is here. Please take what you require. My mistake was egregious." Silva slowly handed Radek's rifle back to him, the exchange meticulous and smooth, a ritual performed between equals. "Thank you, Sergeant Radek," she said. "Your intervention was noted." She then turned to Morrison, her face now completely neutral, the warmth of the exchange with Radek completely gone. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "the Level 4 biosolvent requires a signed triplicate log, page 73A, section 4. Do you have the proper paperwork, or do I need to explain the allocation procedures for a high-value asset again?" Morrison's face paled further. He was trapped in his own system, humiliated by the very rules he sought to enforce. I'll retrieve the forms immediately, Corporal," he squeaked, turning to sprint back to his desk, the memory of her silent battlefield narration echoing in his ears, the scorching sand, the machine gun fire, the 3.2 seconds of heroic exposure. Radek watched Morrison retreat, then met Silva's eyes one last time. He gave a sharp professional nod, a silent recognition of her victory in the depot. "Get off the mat, Princess," Radek whispered, using a phrase common among instructors who push students beyond breaking point. He was not insulting her. He was referencing the crucible she survived. "I broke his arm, Sergeant," Silva replied, her hand moving back to the handle of her mop. "Now, I returned to cleaning the wounds." She watched Morrison scramble for the forms, then looked down at the mop head. It no longer felt like a symbol of humiliation, but a necessary tool. The Krzyż Walecznych gleamed faintly on her chest, a silent, heavy statement against the sterile yellow light of the supply depot. The greatest warriors, she knew, were the ones who cleaned up the mess so the fighting could continue unburdened. And sometimes, to get the job done, you had to remind the system exactly what kind of grit was required for the cleanup. She took the heaviest drum of solvent, lifted it easily, and wheeled her cart toward the decontamination bay, the faint, persistent weight of the Krzyż Walecznych providing the only necessary validation.